The hammer of the Colt Navy revolver clicked back, a sound as sharp and final as a dry branch snapping under a boot heel. In the suffocating heat of the stable, the noise seemed loud enough to wake the dead, or worse, the soldiers patrolling the main street of Red Mesa. Claire Monroe held the weapon with two hands, just as her father had taught her, though he had never intended for her to aim it at a living, breathing man. Her knuckles were white, draining of blood, contrasting starkly against the rusted iron of the barrel. Dust motes danced in the single shaft of moonlight cutting through the wooden slats of the barn, illuminating the stalls where the horses shifted nervously, smelling the metallic tang of blood. "Come out," Claire ordered. Her voice trembled, betraying the 24 years of life she had lived mostly in the safety of the dispensary, smelling of camphor and peppermint rather than gunpowder. "I know you are there. I saw the blood trail." For a long moment, there was only the sound of the wind howling off the red rocks of the canyon, a mournful whistle that haunted the Arizona Territory in the year 1875. Then, a shadow detached itself from the darkness of the rear stall. He moved not like a man, but like a wounded mountain lion fluid, dangerous, and favoring his left side. He stepped into the sliver of moonlight. He was tall, lean, and unmistakably Apache. His hair was long and black, held back by a simple cloth band. His eyes were dark pools of defiance. Even his pain etched deep lines around his mouth. He wore buckskins that had seen better days, stained now with the dark, wet blossoming of a fresh wound on his shoulder. Claire's breath hitched. The stories whispered in the general store, the terrors printed in the territorial newspapers, all screamed at her to pull the trigger. They said the Apache were monsters, spirits of the desert sent to scour the white man from the earth. But the man raised a hand, palm open. It was not a gesture of surrender, but one of peace. "I am not here to hurt you," he rasped. His voice was rough, like gravel grinding together. His English was broken, accented with the guttural tones of the Athabascan language. He swayed on his feet, his hand gripping the wooden post of the stall for support. "I only need a bandage." Claire did not lower the gun. "You are Taza," she whispered, the name slipping out before she could stop it. He paused, his eyes narrowing. He did not deny it. "Taza, the son of the war chief, the ghost who haunted the nightmares of the cavalry. And you," he said, his breathing shallow, "are the daughter of the healer." The gun felt heavy in her hands, a pound of steel that felt like a ton of moral judgment. Outside, the town of Red Mesa was drinking itself into a stupor. She could hear the distant, tinny sound of a piano from the saloon, playing a cheerful tune that felt grotesque against the reality of the bleeding man in front of her. "If I scream," Claire said, testing the weight of the words. "Deputy Lane will be here in 2 minutes. Colonel Briggs and his men will surround this barn in 5. Then I die," Taza said simply. He looked at her, not with begging eyes, but with a weary acceptance that broke something inside her chest. "And the spirits will welcome me, but the wound, it burns. I cannot ride." Claire looked at the blood dripping from his fingers onto the straw-covered floor. It was red. It was just as red as the blood of the miners her father stitched up after a bar fight. Just as red as the blood of the soldiers who came in with heat stroke or snake bites. "Dr. Monroe," she corrected him, though her father was asleep in the house attached to the dispensary. "My father is the healer. I am just Claire." "Healer's hands," Taza murmured, looking at her grip on the gun. "Or killer's hands tonight, you choose." Slowly, agonizingly slowly. Claire lowered the hammer of the Colt. She didn't holster it, but she placed it on a crate within arm's reach. The tension in the room did not dissipate. It merely changed shape, shifting from the threat of violence to the terrifying intimacy of conspiracy. "Sit," she ordered, pointing to a stack of hay bales. "Before you fall down." Red Mesa was a town built on red dirt and big promises. It sat precariously on the border of the Arizona and New Mexico territories, a cluster of wooden buildings that looked as if they might be blown away by a strong enough gust of wind. It was a place where water cost more than whiskey, and a man's life was worth about as much as the horse he rode in on. For the last 6 months, the air in Red Mesa had been thick enough to cut with a knife. The silver mines to the north were producing well, but it was the rumor of the railroad that had turned the town into a powder keg. The Silver Star Rail Company wanted to lay tracks through the valley, a direct line that would connect the riches of the west to the markets of the east. There was only one problem, Owl Canyon. Owl Canyon was a narrow, verdant slash in the earth where the water ran deep and cold even in the height of summer. It was the only reliable source of water for 50 miles. And it belonged, by blood and by treaty, though treaties were burning paper in these parts, to the Apache. Claire moved efficiently around the small tack room she used for overflow supplies, gathering clean linen strips, a bottle of carbolic acid, and a pair of forceps. Her heart was hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She was committing treason. In the eyes of Colonel Briggs, aiding an Apache warrior was no different than shooting a soldier herself. She returned to Taza. He had sunk onto the hay bale, his head bowed. When she approached, he flinched, his hand instinctively going to the knife at his belt before he stopped himself. "I need to clean it," Claire said, her voice steadier now that she had a task. "This will hurt. I have whiskey if you want it." Taza shook his head. "Clear mind," he grunted. Claire knelt beside him. The smell of him was distinct sagebrush, wood smoke, and the copper scent of old blood. It was not an unpleasant smell. It was the smell of the land itself. She took a pair of scissors and cut away the ruined buckskin shirt. Exposing the shoulder, it was a gunshot wound. The bullet had grazed the muscle, tearing a deep furrow but missing the bone. "A soldier's rifle," she noted, looking at the tear. "A thief's rifle," Taza corrected. "Men who steal cattle and blame the Apache." Claire paused, the bottle of acid hovering over the wound. "The town says you raided the McAllister ranch 3 days ago. They say you burned the barn and stole 10 horses. Taza looked up, his eyes locking with hers. Up close, she saw the gold flecks in the iris, the exhaustion that bruised the skin beneath his lower lashes. "I was in the high mountains 3 days ago, hunting deer. My people are starving. Woman of the healer. We do not eat horses if we can help it, and we do not burn barns for sport. Colonel Briggs says..." "Briggs." Taza spat the name like a curse. "Briggs wants a war. A war gives him glory. A war gives the railroad an excuse to take the canyon." Claire poured the acid. Taza's entire body became rigid. The muscles in his neck stood out like steel cables, and a sheen of sweat instantly popped out on his forehead. He did not cry out. He did not make a sound. He simply breathed, a sharp intake of air through his nose, and endured it. It was that silence that convinced her more than any words could have. A man who could endure such pain with such dignity was not the savage animal depicted in the penny dreadful novels Deputy Lane liked to read. "My mother?" Claire said softly as she began to wrap the clean linen around his shoulder. "Told me that pain is the body's way of saying it wants to live." Taza looked at her, surprised. "Your mother knew the people." "She was a translator," Claire said, tying off the bandage. "Before she died, she taught me little things." She hesitated, then spoke a phrase in Apache, the words feeling strange and heavy on her tongue. "Nijonigo che diga, walk in beauty." Taza stared at her. The hostility in his posture evaporated, replaced by a profound confusion. "You speak the tongue." "Only a little," she admitted, switching back to English. She believed that if you speak to a man in his own language, you speak to his heart. If you speak to him in yours, you speak only to his head. "Your mother was wise," Taza said quietly. He tested his arm, wincing slightly but nodding in approval. "Better than the army butchers." "My father taught me well," Claire said, standing up and wiping her hands on her apron. She felt a strange flush of pride at the compliment. Suddenly, voices drifted from the alleyway outside the stable. Heavy boots crunched on the gravel. "I'm telling you, Silas, we pushed them out before the first frost." It was the booming, authoritative baritone of Colonel Briggs. Claire froze. Taza was already moving, sliding into the deepest shadows of the stall. Blending so perfectly with the darkness, he seemed to vanish. "The investors are getting impatient." "Colonel!" came the smooth, oily reply of Silas Hargrove. Silas was a man who wore silk vests in the desert and wiped his brow with a handkerchief that cost more than a miner made in a month. They want the survey markers in Owl Canyon by the 1st of November. You get me the authorization to use full force, and I will clear that canyon, Briggs said, his voice drawing nearer to the stable doors. We just need a provocation. Something big. Something that makes the newspapers in Washington scream for blood. The McAllister raid wasn't enough, Silas asked. Small potatoes. Briggs scoffed. They paused right outside the stable door. Claire held her breath, her hand hovering near the lantern, debating whether to extinguish it. We need a massacre, or the threat of one. Well, Silas chuckled, the sound like dry leaves skittering on stone. I am sure we can arrange for the savages to be uncooperative. The footsteps faded as the two men walked toward the hotel. Claire let out a breath she felt she had been holding for 5 minutes. Her heart was pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She turned to look at the shadows. Taza stepped out. His face was hard, his jaw set in a line of grim determination. He had heard every word. You heard them, Claire whispered. They are planning something. They are always planning, Taza said. He moved to the back door of the stable, the one that opened out toward the open desert and the sagebrush. They want the water. They want the gold they think is in the rocks. They will not stop until we are dead or gone. You should go to the reservation, Claire said, though the words tasted like ash in her mouth even as she spoke them. It is safe there. The government promised. The government promises are written on water. Taza cut her off. He turned to look at her one last time. The moonlight caught the sharp angles of his cheekbones. My father died on the reservation, of a cough that made him spit blood. There is no game there. The water is sour. Owl Canyon is our home. It is where my ancestors are buried. I will not leave it. He placed a hand on the wooden door frame. You have good hands. Claire Monroe, you saved a life tonight. But be careful. The snake that bites does not always rattle first. Wait, Claire said, stepping forward. She didn't know why she stopped him. It was dangerous to keep him here a second longer. If they find you, they will not find me, he said. He looked at her then, really looked at her. For a moment, the barrier of race, of war, of the hatred brewing in the town outside, seemed to thin. She saw a man who was fighting for his home. He saw a woman who had shown mercy when she should have shown hate. It was a dangerous look. It was a look that could get them both killed. Why did you come here? She asked. To town. It's suicide. I needed to hear, Taza said softly. I needed to know if the Iron Horse man spoke true. Now I know. He opened the door. The cool night air rushed in, smelling of ozone and distant rain. Go, Claire said, her voice barely audible. Do not trust the man in the silk vest, Taza warned. And watch the deputy. He has eyes that look at you, but he sees only a prize to be won. With that, he slipped out into the night. There was no sound of footsteps, no rustle of brush. He was simply gone, reclaimed by the desert. Claire stood alone in the stable. She looked down at her hands. They were stained with a small smear of his blood. She should wash it off. She should scrub it until her skin is pink and raw. She should go to her father and tell him what happened. She should go to Deputy Lane and report an intruder, but she didn't. She walked over to the bucket of water and dipped a rag into it, wiping the blood from her fingers slowly. As she stared at the red swirl in the water, the words of Colonel Briggs echoed in her mind. We need a massacre. And she remembered her father's voice from years ago, when she had asked why the townspeople hated the Apache so much. No one is born a devil. Claire, only those who lose everything become that way. Claire Monroe dried her hands. She checked the Colt revolver to make sure the safety was on, and hid the bloody rags deep in the refuse pile where no one would look. She walked to the stable doors and looked out at the sleeping town of Red Mesa. It looked peaceful under the starlight, but Claire knew better now. The peace was a lie. The war was already here. It just hadn't started shooting yet. And for the first time in her life, She wasn't sure she was on the right side of it. She touched the spot on her apron where Taza's blood had been. A strange shiver went through her, not of fear, but of awakening. The desert was vast, and the night was deep, and somewhere out there, a warrior was riding home with a bandage tied by her hands. She turned off the lantern, plunging the stable into darkness. But the image of his eyes, dark, fierce, and undeniably human, burned bright in her mind. The heat in the back room of the dispensary was a physical weight, pressing down on Claire Monroe's shoulders as she sorted through the shipment of quinine that had arrived on the morning stagecoach. The air smelled of dried sage, rubbing alcohol, and the stale cigar smoke that clung to the clothes of her father's patients. Through the thin partition wall that separated the storage area from the examination room, voices drifted in low, tense, and carrying an authority that made the hair on Claire's arms stand up. She recognized the gruff baritone of Colonel Briggs immediately. He had come in to have a gash on his forearm stitched, an injury he claimed came from a slip while shoeing a horse, though the jagged nature of the tear suggested something sharper and more violent. "It has to be done before the first snow falls in the high country," a second voice said. It was smooth, cultured, and utterly devoid of warmth. Silas Hargrove. Claire froze, her hand hovering over a jar of glass vials. She knew she should announce her presence, cough loudly, or knock a bottle over. Eavesdropping on the two most powerful men in the territory was a dangerous game. Yet, her feet remained rooted to the floorboards. "My men are ready," Briggs grunted. There was the wet sound of a cloth being dipped into a basin. "But I cannot just march a regiment into Owl Canyon and start shooting. The Department of the Interior is breathing down my neck. They want peace treaties, not massacres. Unless, of course, I am forced to defend the citizenry." "Defend?" Silas repeated, the word rolling off his tongue like a caress. A noble concept, and if the Apache were to, say, attack a supply train, or perhaps burn a homestead closer to town, that would justify a defensive maneuver, would it not? "It would," Briggs agreed, his voice tight as the needle presumably pierced his skin. "But Taza and his band are ghosts. They strike and vanish. They have not taken the bait on the livestock raids." "Then we stop waiting for them to take the bait," Silas said. "We create the bait, and we create the attacker. I have a shipment of rifles coming in on the wagon train next week. Silver Star Rail property. If those rifles were to disappear during a raid that looks very much like the work of our friends in the canyon." "Well, and the canyon?" Briggs asked. "Once the public outcry hits the papers in Tucson, you will have your mandate to clear it out. We need that water source for the steam engines. Colonel, and the survey reports suggest a vein of silver running right through the east wall. It is progress. You are simply the instrument of destiny." Claire felt a wave of nausea roll through her stomach. They were not talking about law enforcement. They were talking about manufacturing a war. She pressed a hand to her mouth to stifle a gasp, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. Owl Canyon. They were going to burn it to the ground, and they were going to blame Taza for starting the fire. The heavy oak door of the examination room opened and closed some 10 minutes later. Claire waited until the sound of their boots faded down the boardwalk before she emerged, her face pale. Dr. Monroe was wiping his instruments with a rag, his face lined with a weariness that went deeper than age. He looked up as Claire entered, and he saw the knowledge in her eyes. "You heard," he said simply. It was not a question. "They are going to frame them." "Father," Claire whispered, clutching the edge of the examination table. "They are going to kill everyone in that canyon so Silas Hargrove can lay his tracks and dig his mines. We have to tell someone. We have to go to the marshal in Tucson." Dr. Monroe sighed, placing a pair of forceps into a tray of carbolic acid. He walked over to the window and looked out at the dusty street, where the sign for the Silver Star Rail Company was being painted on a new office building. "Claire," he said gently, "Silas Hargrove owns the bank that holds the mortgage on the marshal's office. Colonel Briggs commands the only law enforcement for 200 miles. Who exactly do you think will listen?" "But it is murder," she insisted, her voice rising. "It is wrong." "It is power," the doctor corrected her. And in this world, when men with power decide on a truth, anyone who speaks against it is not called a hero. They are called traitors. If you speak out, they will destroy you, and they will destroy me." He turned to her, his eyes pleading, "Stay out of it, Claire, please. Our job is to mend the bodies they break, not to stand between the hammer and the anvil." 3 days later, the moral heavy lifting of her conscience had not become any lighter. The atmosphere in Red Mesa was brittle, like dry kindling waiting for a spark. Every conversation in the general store seemed to revolve around the Indian threat, fueled by rumors that no one could trace to a source. Claire had buried herself in work to keep from screaming the truth in the middle of the town square. On this particular Tuesday afternoon, her work took her out of town. The Miller Ranch, located 12 miles to the west, had a child with a fever that would not break. Dr. Monroe was tending to a miner with a crushed leg, so Claire had loaded the buggy with willow bark, cooling salts, and clean linens. The road was a narrow ribbon of hard-packed dirt winding through a landscape of towering red mesas and scrub brush. The sun was high and fierce, bleaching the color from the sky. Claire held the reins loosely, her mind drifting back to the shadowed stable and the wounded warrior she had helped. Has Taza returned to the canyon? Was he already dead? She was passing through a narrow cut in the rocks, a place where the shadows stretched long even at midday. When the world exploded into chaos, a gunshot cracked through the air, echoing off the canyon walls. Her horse reared, screaming in panic. Claire fought the reins, but the buggy lurched violently to the left as a second shot splintered the wood of the seat inches from her hip. "Get down!" a voice roared, but it was not a voice of rescue. From the rocks above, 3 figures leaped down into the road, blocking her path. They were terrifying. Their faces were painted in jagged stripes of black and red, their hair wild, and they wore buckskins adorned with feathers. They moved with aggressive, theatrical leaps, whooping war cries that sounded like the nightmares of a child. Claire scrambled backward, grabbing for the whip. One of the men lunged forward and seized the bridle of her horse, dragging the animal to a halt. Another man, huge and smelling of unwashed sweat, leaped onto the buggy step and grabbed Claire by the arm. "Let me go!" Claire screamed, lashing out with her free hand. She raked her nails across his face. The man grunted, a sound that was distinctly English, and backhanded her. The force of the blow threw her against the side of the buggy. Stars burst in her vision. "Grab her," the man growled to his companion. "Make it look like a kidnapping. Leave the buggy here to be found." Terror, cold and absolute, washed over her. This was it. This was the bait Silas had spoken of. A white woman, the doctor's daughter, was snatched by savages. Her death or disappearance would bring the army down on Owl Canyon within 24 hours. The man dragged her from the seat, her boots scraping uselessly against the wheel. She opened her mouth to scream again, but the sound was cut off by a sudden, sickening thud. The man holding her stiffened, his eyes going wide. He looked down. An arrow, fletched with hawk feathers, was protruding from the center of his chest. He fell backward, releasing Claire. She scrambled into the dirt, coughing, trying to make sense of the sudden silence. The war whoops had stopped. The second man, the one holding the horse, was reaching for the rifle slung across his back. He never touched it. A blurred shape dropped from the rocks above a figure of silent, deadly efficiency. A knife flashed in the sunlight. The second attacker crumpled to the ground, clutching his leg, incapacitated but alive. The third man, seeing his odds evaporate, turned to run, but he froze as a figure stepped out from the shadow of the mesa. It was Taza. He held a Winchester rifle, but he did not fire it. He merely stood there, his presence radiating a controlled violence that was far more terrifying than the theatrical screaming of the attackers. The third man threw his hands up. "Don't shoot, I surrender." Taza walked forward, his movements fluid despite the bandage that was still visible beneath his shirt. He looked at the man on the ground, then at the one with his hands up, then, finally, his dark eyes found Claire. "Are you hurt?" he asked. Claire shook her head. Though her cheek throbbed where she had been struck, she pulled herself up, using the buggy wheel for support. I don't think so. Taza nodded to the two warriors with him. They moved quickly, binding the hands of the surviving attackers with rawhide strips. Taza walked over to the dead man, the one who had struck Claire, and nudged the body with his toe. "Look," Taza said, pointing at the dead man's feet. Claire stepped closer, her stomach turning, but she forced herself to look. The man was wearing buckskin trousers, but on his feet were heavy, hobnailed cavalry boots. The leather was thick, rigid, and distinctly manufactured by a machine, not stitched by hand. "Army issue," Claire whispered. "And look at the weapon," Taza said, gesturing to the rifle lying in the dust. Claire knelt and looked at the stock of the gun. Burned into the wood was a small, circular brand, a star within a circle. Silver Star Rail Property. "They are not Apache," Taza said, his voice cold. "They are hired guns, drifters, men who sell their souls for silver." He turned to face Claire, and the intensity of his gaze pinned her in place. "They were not going to ransom you, Claire Monroe. They were going to kill you, and they were going to leave your body with an Apache arrow in it, an arrow they likely stole or bought from a trader." "I heard them," Claire admitted, her voice trembling as the adrenaline began to fade, leaving her shaking. "I heard Briggs and Hargrove talking. They said they needed a provocation. I didn't think it would be me." "It would have been anyone," Taza said. "But you are valuable. The daughter of the healer. The White Town loves you. Your death would make men who have never held a gun want to march into my canyon and kill children." He stepped closer, invading her personal space, but she did not step back. "They will come for my people now, even without your death. They will find another way, and if you remain silent, they will drag you before a judge and ask you to describe the savages who attacked you. They will use your fear as a weapon against us." "I won't let them," Claire said, a sudden fierce anger replacing her fear. "I saw their boots. I saw their faces. They are white men." "Who will believe you?" Taza asked sadly. "The colonel, the banker." He looked past her, toward the west, where the red rocks gave way to the hidden entrance of Owl Canyon. "We have wounded," he said abruptly. "Not from this, but from a skirmish with the surveyors yesterday. We have no medicine. Our healer was killed last winter." He looked back at her. It was a challenge, and an invitation. "You have your bag." Claire looked at the buggy, then back at the road leading to Red Mesa. If she went back now, she was safe. She could lock the door and pretend this never happened. But she looked at the dead mercenary in his army boots, and she thought of the cold calculation in Silas Hargrove's voice. "Take me to them," she said. The journey into Owl Canyon took 2 hours of hard riding through terrain that no buggy could navigate. Claire rode one of the attackers' horses, following Taza through a maze of twisting ravines and hidden switchbacks. When they finally broke through the last narrow pass, the world changed. The heat and dust of the outer desert vanished, replaced by the cool, sweet scent of water and pine. The canyon opened up into a lush valley, sheltered by towering walls of red stone. A creek ran through the center, lined with cottonwood trees that rustled in the breeze. Smoke curled from the tops of wickiups, dome-shaped dwellings made of brush and canvas. Children were running along the banks of the creek, their laughter echoing off the canyon walls. Women were grinding corn on flat stones or weaving baskets. It was a scene of such domestic normalcy that it took Claire's breath away. These were the monsters. These were the demons Briggs wanted to exterminate as they rode in. Silence rippled through the camp. Dark eyes watched her with suspicion and fear. Taza raised his hand, speaking rapidly in his own tongue, his voice carrying authority. The tension did not vanish, but it held. He led her to a shelter near the center of the camp. "My cousin," he said. Mika, a young woman, perhaps 16 years old, stepped out. She had a fierce, intelligent face and eyes that mirrored Taza's. She looked at Claire with open curiosity, not hate. "She brings medicine," Taza told Mika in English. "She is the daughter of the White Healer." For the next 3 hours, Claire worked. She cleaned gunshot wounds that had begun to fester. She set a child's broken arm. She applied salve to the burns on an old woman's hands. She worked until her back ached and her dress was stained with sweat and dirt. She saw them, not as a collective enemy, but as individuals. She saw the way a mother hummed to her baby to keep him calm, while Claire stitched a cut. She saw the way the old men laughed softly as they played a game with sticks and stones. She saw a community that was holding onto its existence by a thread. As the sun began to dip below the rim of the canyon, casting long purple shadows across the valley, Claire packed her bag. The reality of her situation was settling in. She had crossed a line. She had aided the enemy. Taza walked her to the edge of the camp, where the horses were waiting. "You cannot come back here," he said quietly. "It is too dangerous. If Briggs finds out you know the way." "I won't tell him," Claire said. "I swear it." "I believe you," Taza said. He reached into a pouch at his belt and pulled out something small. He took her hand and pressed the object into her palm. It was a talisman, a small piece of white bone, polished smooth by time, bound together with a dark stone by a strip of leather. It felt warm in her hand. "It is old," Taza said. "From the time before the Spanish came. It is for protection, to remind you that the spirits watch, even when the law does not." Claire closed her fingers around the charm. "Taza, they are coming, soon. With the new rifles?" "I know," he said. His face was a mask of tragic resolve. "But this is where our ancestors sleep. We will not run." "You don't have to run," Claire said, her mind racing. "But you have to be smart. You cannot fight them head on, not with Briggs involved. Then we will fight them our way," Taza said. He helped her mount the horse. For a moment, his hand lingered on her boot. The contact was brief, electric, and terrifyingly improper for a woman of her station and a man of his. "Go," he said. "Walk in beauty. Claire Monroe." "Stay alive, Taza," she whispered. She turned the horse and rode back toward the twisted labyrinth of the canyon entrance. She clutched the bone charm so tightly it bit into her palm. She was returning to Red Mesa, to her father, to the deputy who wanted to marry her, and to the men who were plotting murder in the name of progress. She carried a secret now, heavy and sharp in her chest. She was no longer just an observer. The line between the two worlds had blurred, and she was standing right in the middle of the divide. And as the first star appeared in the darkening sky, Claire knew that she would never be just the doctor's daughter again. She was a witness, and soon she would have to decide if she was brave enough to be a traitor to her own kind. Red Mesa was drowning in paper. It started on a Monday morning, just as the sun crested the eastern ridges, turning the sky a bruised purple. By the time the town awoke, the posters were everywhere. They were pasted onto the side of the saloon, nailed to the hitching posts, and plastered across the window of the general store. The ink was still fresh, black and stark against the white paper. Warning: Apache marauders. Protect your homes. Below the bold lettering was a crude woodcut illustration of a savage warrior with a knife in his teeth, looming over a cowering white woman. It was a piece of fiction so grotesque it would have been laughable, had it not been so dangerous. Claire Monroe tore one of the posters off the wall of her father's dispensary. The paper made a dry ripping sound. She crumpled it in her fist, her knuckles turning white. "It is good artwork, is it not?" Claire spun around. Silas Hargrove stood on the boardwalk, tapping a silver-tipped cane against the wooden planks. He wore a suit of gray wool that seemed impervious to the desert dust. "It is a lie, Mr. Hargrove," Claire said, her voice shaking with suppressed anger. "You are scaring people for no reason. Fear is a tool, Miss Monroe," Silas replied smoothly. "Just like a hammer or a railroad spike. It builds things. In this case, it builds consensus. The people need to understand that progress requires security." He tipped his hat and walked away, leaving Claire standing in the morning heat with the crumpled lie in her hand. The town was changing. The uneasy truce that had existed for years was evaporating like water on a hot skillet. Men who used to nod at Claire as she passed now looked at her with hard, suspicious eyes. The saloon was louder at night, filled with talk of militias and bounties. Deputy Lane was at the center of it. He walked the streets with his chest puffed out, his hand resting perpetually on the handle of his gun. He was organizing a citizen safety committee, which Claire knew was just a polite name for a lynch mob. That afternoon, whilst Claire was buying flour at the mercantile, Mrs. Gable cornered her near the pickle barrel. Mrs. Gable was a woman whose kindness was always laced with judgment. "You ought to be careful, Claire." Mrs. Gable whispered, leaning in close so the smell of lavender water and stale sweat filled Claire's nose. "People talk. They say you have a soft spot for the wild ones. They say your mother's blood runs a little too hot in you." "My mother was a translator, Mrs. Gable," Claire said coldly. "She believed in understanding people, not shooting them." "Well," Mrs. Gable sniffed, straightening her bonnet, "understanding won't stop an arrow. Dear, you stick to your own kind. If you don't, you might find yourself pulled down into the dirt with them." The warning was clear. Pick a side, or one will be picked for you. But Claire had already made her choice. The meeting place was a cluster of boulders 3 miles south of town, where the scrub brush gave way to the true emptiness of the desert. It was a place of deep shadows and silence. Claire rode out under the cover of darkness, telling her father she was checking on the widow Thompson's gout. It was a lie that tasted bitter on her tongue, but the truth was too dangerous to speak. Taza was always there before her. He did not emerge from the rocks. He simply appeared, as if he had unspooled himself from the darkness itself. "The soldiers are moving closer to the canyon mouth," Claire whispered. They sat on the ground, separated by a respectful distance, yet the air between them hummed with an invisible current. "Briggs has doubled the patrols. They are cutting off the game trails." "We know," Taza said. His voice was low, a rumble that vibrated in the quiet night. "They poisoned the lower spring yesterday. 2 of our horses died. We had to burn the carcasses." Claire gasped. "Poison, but that is against every law of war." "It is not war to them," Taza said, looking up at the vast spray of stars above them. "It is extermination, like clearing rats from a barn." He turned to look at her. In the moonlight, the sharp angles of his face were softened. "Why do you come here, Claire? Every time you ride out, you risk your life. If the deputy finds you—" "I cannot sit in that town and listen to their lies," Claire said. She picked up a handful of red sand and let it sift through her fingers. "My father says we must stay neutral. But how can you be neutral when you see a boot on someone's neck?" "Your father is a good man," Taza said. "He wants you to live." "I want to live," Claire agreed. "But I want to be able to look at myself in the mirror." She hesitated, then looked at him. "My mother, she used to tell me stories about the spirits of this land. She said the wind has a memory. If we do wrong here, the wind will remember it forever." Taza went still. "My father told me that the land and the people are the same thing. If you hurt the land, you hurt the people. If you hurt the people, the land bleeds." He reached out, his hand hovering near hers on the cool sand. He did not touch her, but the proximity was enough to send a jolt through her arm. "We are not so different," he murmured. "You live in a cage of wood and glass. I live in a cage of soldiers and guns. We both look for a door." "I don't think I can open mine alone," Claire confessed, her voice barely a whisper. "Then we will push together," Taza promised. For a moment, there was no war, no railroad, no hate. There was only a man and a woman under the vast, indifferent sky, finding a common language in their shared isolation. It was a fragile thing, this bond, growing in the cracks of a broken world. But it was the most real thing Claire had ever felt. The crackdown began in earnest 2 days later. It was not a battle, but a slow suffocation. Colonel Briggs issued an order declaring the town limits off-limits to all non-citizens without a military pass. It was a way to starve the Apache who traded woven baskets and firewood for salt and cloth. Claire was sweeping the porch of the dispensary when she heard the commotion. A young Apache boy, no older than 12, had walked into town. He was skinny, with ribs showing through his shirt, and he held a few silver coins in his hand, likely found or begged. He was heading for the general store. Deputy Lane intercepted him in the middle of the street. "Where do you think you are going, boy?" Lane barked, his hand resting on his belt. The boy did not speak English. He held up the coins and pointed at the barrels of salt outside the store. "No trade," Lane said, stepping closer. "Get back to your rocks." The boy, confused or perhaps desperate, tried to step around the deputy. Lane's hand lashed out. He backhanded the boy across the face, sending him sprawling into the dust. The coins scattered, glinting in the harsh sunlight. "I said get back!" Lane shouted, kicking the boy in the ribs. "Stop it!" Claire screamed. She dropped her broom and ran into the street. "He is a child. Lane, leave him alone." She threw herself between the deputy and the boy. Lane stopped, his face flushed with adrenaline and heat. He looked at Claire, and for a second, she saw a flicker of madness in his eyes. "Move aside, Claire," Lane growled. "This doesn't concern you." "Cruelty concerns everyone," Claire snapped. She knelt down and helped the boy sit up. His lip was split, bleeding down his chin. He looked at her with wide, terrified eyes. "Go," she whispered to him, pointing west. "Run!" The boy scrambled up and sprinted away, leaving his coins in the dirt. Lane watched him go, then turned his gaze to Claire. "You are making a mistake. Claire, you are choosing the losing side, and I can't keep protecting you if you insist on standing in the line of fire." "I don't need your protection," Claire said, standing up and brushing the dust from her skirt. "I need you to act like a human being." Lane stepped closer, invading her space. "I am doing this for you," he hissed. "For us, when the railroad comes, this town will be rich. We could have a good life, a big house, but not if you keep playing nursemaid to the enemy. I would rather live in a tent than in a house built on blood," Claire said. Lane grabbed her arm. His grip was painful. "You listen to me. I see you looking at the horizon. I see you waiting. If I find out you are meeting someone out there, God help me. Claire, I will burn this whole territory down to save you from yourself." He released her and stormed off. Claire stood in the street, shaking. It was not a proposal of marriage. It was a threat of ownership. Desperate to stop the slide toward violence, Claire convinced Dr. Monroe to call a meeting. It was held in the small church vestry. She gathered the few people who still had a conscience: Reverend Thomas, a man who believed the gospel applied to everyone; Mr. Henderson, an old rancher who had traded with Taza's father for years, and her father. They invited Silas Hargrove, hoping to appeal to his cause. Silas arrived late, smelling of expensive cologne. He listened as the doctor spoke of the Hippocratic Oath, as the Reverend spoke of Christian charity, and as Henderson spoke of the practical benefits of peace. "We can negotiate a treaty," Claire argued, her voice passionate. "The Apache want peace. They only fight because they are cornered. If the railroad agrees to route around the sacred burial grounds in the canyon, Taza will agree to protect the workers." Silas listened, a polite smile fixed on his face. When Claire finished, he stood up and smoothed his vest. "Miss Monroe," he said, his voice dripping with condescension, "you have a romantic view of the world. It is charming. But the Silver Star Rail Company is not a charity. We are an engine of commerce. We do not route around obstacles. We go through them. They are people," Claire said. "Not obstacles. They are remnants of the past," Silas said, checking his pocket watch. "And the future has no time for the past. There will be no negotiation. The canyon will be cleared. Good evening." He walked out, leaving the room silent. Claire looked at her father. Dr. Monroe had his head in his hands. The meeting had not just failed. It had confirmed their worst fears. There was no political solution. The breaking point came 3 nights later. Claire was in the kitchen, grinding coffee beans, when the alarm bell began to ring. It was a frantic clanging sound that signaled disaster. She ran out onto the porch. To the north, the night sky was glowing a sickly, vibrant orange. Fire! "It is the Henderson Ranch!" someone shouted. The bucket brigade was useless. The ranch was 5 miles out. By the time the townspeople and the soldiers arrived, the barn was a skeleton of charcoal and the house was a smoldering ruin. Mr. Henderson and his wife had escaped with their lives, but their livelihood was gone. In the corral, 20 heads of cattle lay dead. They had not been taken for food. They had been shot where they stood. Colonel Briggs strode through the ashes, his face grim. He held up an arrow he had pulled from the flank of a dead steer. "Apache," Briggs announced to the gathered crowd. "See the fletching? This is Taza's work. He smiles at you one day and burns you out the next." The crowd murmured, an angry sound like a rising hornet nest. Deputy Lane was there, nodding, his hand on his gun. "We told you," Lane shouted. "We told you they were savages." Claire moved through the smoke, her eyes stinging. Something was wrong. Taza had told her explicitly that they never killed cattle unless they were starving, and even then, they took the meat. This was a waste. This was cruelty. This was a theater. She knelt near the fence line. Away from the main crowd, the ground was churned up by hoof prints. She saw the spot where the shooters must have stood. She brushed away a layer of ash and found it, a brass shell casing. She picked it up. It was heavy and still smelled faintly of sulfur. She held it up to the light of the dying fire. It was a .45, 70 government cartridge, standard issue for the U.S. Cavalry. And it was fresh. The brass was shiny, not tarnished by the elements. "Claire!" She jumped, closing her fist around the casing. Deputy Lane was standing behind her. The firelight cast his shadow long and distorted across the ground. "What do you have there?" he asked, his voice low. "Nothing," Claire said, slipping her hand into her apron pocket. "Just a rock." Lane stepped closer. He smelled of smoke and whiskey. "You should not be here. Claire, it is dangerous." "You see what your friends did. Poor Henderson defended them, and they burned him out. That is the gratitude of a savage." "We do not know who did this," Claire said, her heart hammering against the brass casing in her pocket. "We know," Lane said. He reached out and touched her cheek. His fingers were rough. "And soon, we will make sure they never do it again. I am going to keep you safe. Claire, even if I have to lock you in a tower to do it." Claire pulled away. "I am going to find my father." She walked away, her back stiff, feeling Lane's eyes boring into her shoulder blades. She had the proof. But who would she show it to? The judge was in Silas's pocket. The colonel was the one who issued the bullets. She was holding the truth, and it felt like it was burning a hole in her pocket. Sunday morning brought the final blow. The church was full. The air was stiflingly hot, filled with the rustle of fans and the murmur of prayers. Claire sat beside her father. Her head bowed, but she was not praying. She was planning. After the final hymn, Colonel Briggs walked to the front of the church. He did not take the pulpit. He stood in front of the altar, assuming an authority that superseded God in this territory. "Citizens of Red Mesa," Briggs began, his voice booming off the rafters. "For too long, we have lived in fear. The attack on the Henderson Ranch was the last straw. The federal government has authorized me to take all necessary measures to secure this border." He paused, letting the silence stretch. "In 1 week," Briggs announced, "the 7th Cavalry will conduct a full sweep of Owl Canyon. Any Apache found within the canyon walls after sunrise next Sunday will be considered a hostile combatant. We will clear the valley. We will secure the water. We will end this threat once and for all." The congregation erupted in cheers. Men threw their hats in the air. Women wept with relief. Claire felt the blood drain from her face. 1 week, 7 days. It was a death sentence. She looked across the aisle. Silas Hargrove was sitting in the front row. He was not cheering. He was simply watching the colonel, and on his face was a small, satisfied smile. It was the smile of a man who had just won a chess game before the opponent even realized they were playing. Claire looked at her father. Dr. Monroe was pale, his hands gripping the pew in front of him. 7 days, Claire whispered. "It is a massacre." the doctor replied softly. Claire stood up. She had to get out of there. The air in the church felt toxic. She pushed her way through the cheering crowd, ignoring the hands that reached out to congratulate her on the coming victory. She burst out into the blinding sunlight of the town square. The dust swirled around her boots. 1 week. She touched the pocket where the shell casing and the bone talisman lay together. The evidence of guilt and the promise of protection. She looked toward the western horizon, where the red rocks of Owl Canyon cut into the sky. Taza was out there, unaware that the hourglass had just been turned over. "Don't you dare pull out," she whispered to herself, a fierce promise taking root in her heart. She would not let them die. She did not know how, but she would stop this, even if she had to burn her own life to the ground to do it. The moon hung low and heavy over the desert, a pale eye witnessing a frantic flight. Claire Monroe pushed her horse harder than she ever had before, the animal's hooves striking sparks against the flinty ground. The wind whipped her hair across her face, stinging her eyes. But she did not slow down. In the saddlebags behind her, glass vials of morphine clinked against tins of pemmican, a meager offering for a people facing a massacre. She reached the mouth of Owl Canyon well past midnight. The camp sentries materialized from the darkness before she even saw them, their rifles leveled at her chest. "It is me," she gasped, her voice raspy from the dry air. "Claire, the daughter of the doctor." A familiar figure stepped forward. It was Taza. He grabbed her horse's bridle, his face a mask of concern illuminated by the dying embers of a nearby fire. "You should not be here," he hissed, though his hands were gentle as he helped her slide from the saddle. Her legs nearly gave way, numb from the ride. "The soldiers patrol the perimeter." "They are not just patrolling anymore, Taza," Claire said, gripping his forearm to steady herself. "Briggs spoke in the church. He has given the order. 7 days. In 7 days, the 7th Cavalry will sweep the canyon. Anyone found here will be shot on sight." The silence that followed was heavier than the stone walls surrounding them. Taza looked at her, and, for the first time, Claire saw a flicker of true fear in his dark eyes, not for himself, but for the sleeping families in the wickiups behind him. 7 days, Taza repeated. "We cannot move the old ones that fast, not without leaving a trail a blind man could follow." He turned and led her into the center of the camp. The commotion had awakened the tribe. Men emerged with weapons. Women clutched blankets around their shoulders. Taza spoke rapidly in Apache, his voice low and urgent. As the translation rippled through the crowd, the mood shifted from sleepiness to outrage. An older warrior, a man with skin like cracked leather and a scar running from his ear to his chin, stepped forward. He pointed a gnarled finger at Claire. "She brings this," the elder shouted in broken English, his eyes burning with accusation. "Since she came, the soldiers have come closer. She is the bait. She leads the wolf to the den. No." Claire stepped forward, her chin high despite her trembling knees. "I came to warn you. I came to give you a chance." "A chance to die running," the elder spat. "We should kill her. Send her body back to the colonel as a message. We fight here. We die here." A murmur of agreement ran through the younger men, their hands tightening on their knives. The anger was palpable, a physical heat in the cool night air. "Stop," Mika pushed through the crowd. She stood beside Claire, small but fierce. "She saved my brother's arm," Mika said, her voice ringing clear. "She brought medicine when our own supplies were gone. She risks her life tonight. If she wanted us dead, she would have stayed in her warm bed." Taza raised his hand. The camp fell silent. He looked at the elder, then at Claire. "The woman speaks truth," Taza said, his voice carrying the weight of command. "If she were our enemy, the soldiers would be here now. Not in 7 days. She has bought us time." He turned to the gathered council. "Fighting now is suicide. Briggs wants a battle. He wants us to stand in the open so his cannons can shred us. We will not give him that satisfaction." "Then where do we go?" a woman asked, clutching a baby to her chest. "The passes to the north are blocked. The waterholes to the south are poisoned." Claire took a breath. "The devil's throat. The tribe stared at her. Even Taza looked skeptical. "The slot canyon." Taza shook his head. "It is a trap. The walls are too high. If a flash flood comes, we drown. If they block the ends, we starve." "No," Claire insisted, pulling a folded piece of paper from her dress pocket. It was a sketch she had made from memory, based on the railway survey maps she had seen on Silas Hargrove's desk. The railroad surveyors found a passage. Halfway through the throat, there is a fissure in the east wall. It is hidden by scrub oak. It leads up to the high plateau, the one behind the needle rock. She traced the line with a shaking finger. "It is steep, but it is wide enough for horses if you lead them. The army does not know it is there. Their maps show the canyon as a dead end. They will not look for you there." Taza studied drawing. He looked at Claire, searching her face for any sign of deception. He found only desperation and hope. "The plateau gives us the high ground," Taza murmured. "We can see them coming for miles, and there is a spring there." He looked up, his decision made. "We move, now. Pack only what you can carry. We leave the heavy tents, we leave the pottery, we take the horses, the weapons, and the food." The journey through the Devil's Throat was a nightmare made of stone and shadow. The canyon was so narrow in places that the riders had to dismount and walk sideways, leading their nervous horses. The moonlight did not reach the canyon floor. They moved in absolute darkness, guided only by the sound of the person breathing in front of them. Claire walked near the rear, helping an elderly woman who struggled with the uneven ground. The air was cold and smelled of damp earth and bat guano. Every loose stone that clattered down the slope sounded like a gunshot in the oppressive silence. Twice, they had to stop as rattlesnakes, seeking the warmth of the path, were moved aside by the scouts using long sticks. Taza moved up and down the line, a silent ghost, urging them forward, helping to lift children over boulders, his presence a steadying anchor in the shifting dark. By the time the sky began to turn the gray of a mourning dove's wing, they reached the fissure Claire had described. It was a steep, jagged crack in the canyon wall, choked with brush. "Up!" Taza ordered in a whisper. "Quickly, the sun will reveal us." The climb was brutal. Horses slipped and scrambled, their hooves striking sparks. Men and women hauled each other up ledges, panting, sweating despite the chill. They were halfway up the slope when the crack of a rifle shattered the morning. A bullet struck the rock inches from Claire's head, sending stone splinters stinging into her cheek. "Scouts!" Taza roared. "Take cover!" Below them, on the opposite rim of the canyon, 3 silhouettes were visible against the brightening sky. Army scouts. They had found the trail. Gunfire erupted. The Apache warriors returned fire, the sound deafening in the confined space. Bullets whined off the rocks like angry hornets. "Go, keep climbing!" Taza shouted, shoving Claire toward the shelter of a large boulder. He turned, raising his Winchester to cover the retreat of the women and children. Claire scrambled behind the rock, her heart hammering against her ribs. She looked back. Taza was exposed, firing lever-action rounds with terrifying precision. One of the scouts on the rim fell. Then, Taza jerked violently. He spun around, clutching his side, and dropped to one knee. "Taza!" Claire screamed, ignoring the bullets kicking up dust around her. She lunged from her cover. She grabbed him by his good arm and dragged him behind the boulder. "I am fine," he grunted, trying to push her away. "Go! Be quiet!" Claire snapped. She tore open his shirt. A bullet had gouged a deep furrow across his ribs. It was bleeding freely, the dark blood slick against his copper skin. It was not fatal, but it was messy. "Hold this," she ordered, pressing a wad of cloth against the wound. The gunfire was intensifying. The scouts were pinning them down while sending signals likely to the main column. They had minutes, maybe less, before this skirmish turned into a slaughter. "We need to get to the upper caves," Taza gasped. His teeth gritted against the pain. "The angle. They cannot shoot into the caves." Together, they moved. It was a frantic, scrambling crawl up the last 50 yards of the scree slope. Claire supported Taza's weight, her shoulder wedged under his arm. She could feel the heat radiating from him, the shudder of his muscles with every step. They practically fell into the mouth of the shallow cave near the plateau's rim. It was little more than a deep indentation in the rock, obscured by a twisted juniper tree, but it offered solid stone between them and the shooters. They collapsed onto the dusty floor, gasping for air. Outside, the Apache rearguard had reached the upper ridge and were laying down a withering suppression fire, forcing the scouts to retreat. For a moment, there was only the sound of their ragged breathing. They were pressed together in the cramped space, hiding from the death that hunted them. Taza's blood was on Claire's dress. Her hair had come loose, falling in a wild curtain around her face. Claire checked his wound again. The bleeding had slowed. She began to bind it tighter with a strip torn from her petticoat. Her hands were shaking uncontrollably. Taza watched her. The adrenaline was fading, leaving behind a raw, exposed vulnerability. He reached out and caught her trembling hand, stopping her motions. "You should not have come back," he said, his voice rough. "You should be in your dispensary. Safe." "I told you," Claire whispered, not pulling her hand away. "I choose where I stand." Taza closed his eyes for a second, leaning his head back against the stone wall. "At dawn, I will lead my people far from here, into the deep mountains of Mexico. This land is cursed by their greed. If we stay, we die. If I take them away, maybe the children will live." He looked at her, and the despair in his eyes broke her heart. He was a warrior who had run out of wars he could win. He was preparing to vanish, to become a ghost story, to leave everything he loved behind to save it. "And you," he added softly, "you will go back to the town. You will marry the deputy. You will live a long life, and you will forget the smell of sage and blood." Panic, cold and sharp, pierced through Claire's chest. It was not the panic of being shot at. It was the panic of loss. She realized that if he left now, if he retreated into the unknown, the light that had sparked inside her would go out forever. The railroad would win, Briggs would win, and she would drown in the safety of a life she despised. She grabbed the lapels of his buckskin shirt, her fingers digging into the leather. She pulled him forward, forcing him to look at her. "Don't you dare," she ordered, her voice fierce and low, shaking with the force of her emotion. "Don't you dare pull out." Taza froze. He looked at her mouth, then her eyes. "Do not run," she said, tears finally spilling over, cutting tracks through the dust on her cheeks. "Do not let them take this place from you. Do not let them take you from me. If you leave, they win. If you leave, I am alone." The command hung in the air between them, charged and heavy. It was a plea for survival, for resistance, and for the unspoken thing that had grown between them in the shadows of the war. Taza raised his hand. His fingers, calloused and stained with gunpowder, touched her cheek. He traced the line of her jaw, wiping away a tear. His hand was trembling. "You ask a hard thing, Claire Monroe," he whispered. "I ask the only thing that matters," she replied. He leaned in. The distance between them closed. "This is where I belong." He breathed against her skin. He kissed her. It was not a gentle kiss. It was desperate. It tasted of salt, of dust, and of the metallic tang of fear. It was the collision of two worlds that had been spinning toward each other for months. Taza groaned low in his throat, his good arm wrapping around her waist, pulling her flush against him. Claire buried her hands in his hair, holding him as if he were the only solid thing in a dissolving world. In the cramped darkness of the cave, with the sound of distant gunfire still echoing off the canyon walls, the kiss was a seal. It was a promise that went deeper than blood. They broke apart slowly, their foreheads resting against each other, breathing the same air. "We stay," Taza said, his voice steady now. "We do not run to Mexico. We go to the high plateau. We hold the ground." "And I go back," Claire said, though the thought of leaving his arms made her physically ill. "I go back to Red Mesa. Briggs thinks he has 7 days. I'm going to make sure he does not even have one." "It is dangerous," Taza warned, his thumb stroking her cheekbone. "He will be looking for an army of savages," Claire said, a hard light entering her eyes. He will not be looking for a schoolteacher with a bag of medical supplies. Taza nodded. He reached for his rifle, wincing as his wound stretched. But the pain seemed to matter less now. "Go before the sun is fully up," he said. "Take the horse of the scout I shot. It is fresh." "I will see you," Claire promised. "When this is over, you will see me," Taza vowed. "I will be the one standing on the ridge." Claire rode back toward Red Mesa as the sun crested the horizon, painting the sky in violent shades of orange and blood red. She was exhausted. Her body ached, and dried blood flaked on her dress. But she did not feel weak. She felt like iron forged in fire. She had the evidence. She had the plan. And she had the memory of Taza's mouth on hers. A burning brand that reminded her of what was at stake. She bypassed the main road, taking the goat trails that led to the back of the town. She tied the horse in a ravine a mile out and walked the rest of the way, slipping into the dispensary through the back door just as the town was beginning to stir. She washed her face in the basin, scrubbing away the dirt and the tears. She changed her dress, putting on her Sunday best, a high-collared blue calico that made her look respectable, demure, and harmless. She looked at herself in the mirror. The woman staring back was not the same woman who had aimed a trembling gun at a shadow in the barn. This woman had stared death in the face and ordered it to back down. She walked into the kitchen where her father was sitting with his head in his hands, staring at a cup of cold coffee. "Claire," he gasped, standing up and knocking the chair over. When I saw your bed empty, I thought they had taken you." "They did not take me, Father," Claire said calmly. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the brass shell casing and the bone talisman. She set them on the table with a definitive click. "I went to them," she said, "and I know how to stop Briggs." "Claire, you cannot," Dr. Monroe stammered. "The ceremony, the send-off is in an hour. The whole town is gathering." "Exactly," Claire said. She picked up the doctor's medical bag and emptied it, then began to fill it with something else, not medicine, but the ledger she had stolen from Silas Hargrove's office weeks ago, the one she had been too afraid to decipher until last night, the one that showed the bribes paid to the surveyor. "We are going to the ceremony, Father," Claire said, "and we are going to ruin it." She walked to the door, opened it, and stepped out into the blinding light of the morning. The drums of the military band were already beating in the square. Let them play, she thought. The war had started, but the first shot wasn't going to be fired by a cannon. It was going to be fired by the truth. The sun hung directly overhead, a blinding white disk that turned the town square of Red Mesa into a cauldron of heat and tension. It was 12 o'clock, high noon, the hour when shadows vanished and truths were supposed to be laid bare. The entire population of the town had gathered. Miners with dust in their beards stood shoulder to shoulder with shopkeepers in their Sunday best. Women held parasols against the relentless glare, while children wove through the legs of the crowd, sensing the excitement without understanding the danger. In the center of the square, a wooden platform had been hastily erected, draped in the red, white, and blue of the American flag. Colonel Briggs stood there, his uniform pressed, his brass buttons gleaming like gold coins. Beside him stood Silas Hargrove, looking every inch the benevolent architect of the future. Silas stepped forward to the edge of the podium, raising his hands to quiet the murmuring crowd. "Friends," Silas began, his voice smooth and carrying easily over the wind. "Citizens of Red Mesa, today marks the beginning of a new era. For too long, we have lived under the shadow of fear. For too long, the savage threat in Owl Canyon has choked our commerce and threatened our families." He gestured grandly toward the west. "But the railroad is coming. The Silver Star Rail Company brings with it not just steel and steam, but civilization. It brings a future where your children can sleep safe in their beds. And to secure that future, we must do what is hard. We must clear the path." The crowd cheered. Though the sound was ragged, fear makes men loud, but it does not make them confident. Claire Monroe stood near the back of the crowd. Her heart was hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. Her hand was buried deep in the pocket of her dress, clutching the bone talisman Taza had given her. In her other hand, she held a heavy canvas sack. It contained the evidence she had gathered: the spent shell casing, the government-issue boot she had taken from the dead mercenary, and the piece of blue uniform cloth she had found at the site of the burned ranch. She looked at the faces around her. She saw fear. She saw anger. But she also saw doubt. Colonel Briggs stepped up to the podium as the applause died down. "The 7th Cavalry moves out in 1 hour," he bellowed. "We will sweep the canyon. We will remove the hostile elements. By sunset, Red Mesa will be safe." He drew his saber, the steel hissing as it left the scabbard. "For God and country. For greed and murder." The voice rang out, clear and defiant, cutting through the patriotic fervor. The crowd parted, turning to see who had spoken. Claire walked forward. Her legs felt like water, but her head was high. She moved through the gap in the crowd until she stood at the base of the platform. "Claire," Dr. Monroe whispered from the sidelines, his face pale. "Claire, what are you doing?" "I am speaking the truth, Father," Claire said, her voice trembling but gaining strength. She looked up at Briggs, whose face had turned a mottled shade of purple. "There is no Apache raid coming, Colonel. There never was." "Remove this woman," Briggs barked at Deputy Lane. "She is hysterical with grief." "I am not hysterical," Claire shouted, turning to face the townspeople. She reached into her sack and pulled out the boot. She held it up high. "Look at this. This boot was taken from the foot of one of the men who attacked me on the trail. The men Briggs said were Apache." She threw the boot onto the dust. It landed with a heavy thud. "Since when do Apache warriors wear army-issue hobnailed boots?" She challenged me. A murmur rippled through the crowd. The blacksmith, a burly man named Thomas, stepped forward to look. "She is right," Thomas rumbled. "That is government leather. I showed the mules that carried that shipment last month." "Lies," Silas Hargrove shouted, losing his composure. "She is confused. The savages steal supplies." "Do they steal shell casings too?" Claire pulled the brass cylinder from her pocket. "I found this at the Henderson Ranch, the night it burned. It is a 4570 government cartridge, fresh brass. Not reloaded." She pointed a shaking finger at Silas. "You burned the Henderson Ranch. You hired mercenaries to attack me. You won a war so you can steal the land in the canyon for your mines. You are not protecting us. You are using us." Deputy Lane lunged forward, grabbing Claire by the arm. "That is enough. Claire, you are coming with me." But the crowd was shifting. The seeds of doubt Claire had planted were taking root. "Let her speak. Lane!" A woman's voice called out. It was Mrs. Miller, the rancher's wife. "I saw 3 men riding near the canyon last week. They were white men, Lane, painting their faces." "She is a traitor," Briggs roared, realizing he was losing control of the narrative. "She has been conspiring with the enemy, I have reports. She visits their camp. She gives them aid." He pointed his saber at her. "Arrest her. Charge her with treason against the United States territory. Bind her and put her on the supply wagon. She can ride with us to the canyon. Let us see if her friends shoot at her then." 2 soldiers moved forward, their faces grim. Lane hesitated, looking at Claire, but the pressure of the colonel's glare was too much. He pulled a length of rope from his belt. "I am sorry, Claire," Lane muttered, twisting her arms behind her back. "You are a coward. Lane!" Claire hissed, wincing as the rough hemp bit into her wrists. The soldiers dragged her toward the waiting supply wagon. The crowd was shouting now, arguments breaking out between those who believed Claire and those loyal to the colonel. The situation was teetering on the edge of a riot. And then, the ground seemed to vibrate. It was a low, rhythmic thrumming that grew louder by the second. The shouting in the square died away as heads turned toward the west, on the high ridge of Red Mesa, overlooking the town. A line of figures appeared. They stood silhouetted against the bright sky, motionless as statues. It was Taza, and behind him stood 50 Apache warriors. They did not scream. They did not wave tomahawks. They simply stood there, rifles held across their chests, looking down at the town that wanted them dead. It was a display of discipline that shattered the myth of the mindless savage. "They are here!" a woman screamed. "Form ranks!" Briggs shouted, his voice cracking. "Defensive positions! Fire at will!" The soldiers scrambled to form a firing line. The townspeople panicked, stampeding toward the safety of the buildings. "No!" Claire screamed, struggling against her bonds. "Do not shoot! They are not attacking!" But it was too late for that reason. From the shadow of the hotel porch, where Silas Hargrove's hired men were lurking, a single shot rang out. It cracked through the air like a whip. On the ridge, a warrior fell. That single bullet broke the dam. The ridge erupted in return fire. The soldiers in the square unleashed a volley. The air filled with the deafening roar of gunpowder and the screams of the terrified. It was chaos. Horses reared, overturning the supply wagon. Claire was thrown into the dust, rolling to avoid the hooves of a panicked mule. She struggled to her knees, coughing in the smoke. "Father!" she screamed, looking for the doctor. She saw him. Dr. Monroe was near the edge of the square. A small Apache boy, a captive that Lane had been keeping in the jail to show off as a trophy, had escaped in the confusion and was cowering behind a water trough. A soldier, blinded by smoke and fear, raised his rifle toward the boy. "No!" Dr. Monroe shouted. He threw himself across the trough, shielding the boy with his own body. 2 shots rang out. Dr. Monroe jerked violently, his back arching, and then he slumped forward over the child. "Father!" The scream tore from Claire's throat, raw and agonizing. But she could not go to him. Not yet. Through the swirling dust, she saw Silas Hargrove. He was not fighting. He was scrambling onto a light carriage behind the hotel, clutching a heavy leather satchel to his chest. He was running, and he was taking the proof of his crimes with him. A cold, white-hot rage flooded Claire's veins, drowning out her grief. She looked around for a weapon. Her eyes landed on a shard of glass from a broken whiskey bottle lying in the dirt. She threw herself onto her back, maneuvering her bound hands until her fingers brushed the glass. She sawed at the rope. The glass cut her skin, mixing her blood with the dust. But she did not feel it. The rope frayed and snapped. Claire scrambled to her feet. She grabbed a discarded knife from the belt of a fallen soldier and sprinted toward the hotel. Silas had whipped the horses into a gallop. The carriage was lurching forward. Claire did not think. She ran, her lungs burning, and threw herself at the back of the moving carriage. Her fingers clawed at the wood, finding purchase. She hauled herself up as the vehicle careened around a corner. She climbed over the seat. Silas turned, his eyes widening in shock when he saw her. "You witch!" he shrieked, lashing out with his whip. Claire ducked the leather thong. She lunged at him, the knife held low. She did not want to kill him. She wanted the bag. They grappled, the carriage swaying violently. Silas was stronger, but Claire was fighting with the fury of a daughter who had just watched her father fall. She slammed her elbow into his nose. Blood spurred. Silas cried out, releasing his grip on the satchel to protect his face. Claire grabbed the bag and kicked him hard in the chest. Silas tumbled backward, falling out of the carriage. He hit the dirt and rolled, groaning. Claire grabbed the reins and hauled the horses to a stop. She jumped down, clutching the satchel. Inside, she found the ledger, the contracts, the letters from Briggs agreeing to the price of a massacre. She turned back toward the square. The shooting had slowed. Taza had descended from the ridge. He moved through the smoke like an avenging spirit, his warriors flanking him. They had pushed the soldiers back to the church steps. Colonel Briggs was on his knees in the center of the square. He was wounded, a bullet having taken him in the thigh. His saber lay broken in the dust. Taza stood over him. He held a war club in his hand. His chest was heaving, his face streaked with war paint and sweat. The rage in his eyes was terrifying. He raised the club. "Kill him," a warrior shouted. "For the blood they spilled." Briggs looked up, his eyes squeezed shut, waiting for the blow. "Taza!" Claire's voice cut through the noise. Taza froze. The club hovered inches from Briggs's skull. He turned his head. Claire walked through the smoke. She was bruised, bleeding, and covered in dust, but she held the leather satchel high like a shield. "Do not do it," she said, walking up to him. "If you kill him now, you become exactly what they say you are. You become the monster." "He killed your father," Taza rasped, his voice thick with grief and fury. "I saw it." Claire flinched as if he had struck her. The pain of the loss threatened to buckle her knees, but she locked them. "And he will answer for it," she said. "But not to your club. To the law." She threw the satchel at Briggs's feet. It landed with a heavy slap. "Read it," Claire commanded the townspeople who had emerged from their hiding places. "Read the letters inside. Read how much he was paid to kill us all." The blacksmith, Thomas, stepped forward. He picked up the bag and pulled out a sheaf of papers. He read the first one, his lips moving silently, then looked at Briggs with disgust. "It is true," Thomas announced, his voice booming. "He took $5,000 from the railroad to clear the canyon. It is all here." The mood in the square shifted instantly. The soldiers lowered their rifles, looking at their commander with horror. They had signed up to fight enemies, not to be hired assassins for a mining company. Taza looked down at Briggs. The desire to kill was a living thing in his muscles, demanding release. But he looked at Claire. He saw the pleading in her eyes, the strength she was summoning to keep them both from falling into the abyss of pure violence. Slowly, agonizingly, Taza lowered the club. He spat on the ground next to Briggs. "You are not worth the stain on my weapon." Taza stepped back, leaving Briggs kneeling in the dust, a broken man surrounded by the people he had betrayed. The silence that followed was heavy and suffocating. The battle was over. The truth was out. But the cost lay scattered across the town square in still, silent heaps. Claire dropped the knife. Her strength finally gave out. She stumbled, and Taza caught her. He pulled her against his chest, heedless of the eyes watching them. "My father," she whispered into his buckskin shirt, her voice breaking. "I know," Taza whispered back, holding her tight as she began to shake. "I know." Across the square, Silas Hargrove was being dragged to his feet by 3 angry miners. Deputy Lane stood off to the side, his badge hanging crooked, his head bowed in shame. The sun was beginning to dip in the west, casting long, blood-red shadows across Red Mesa. The climax had passed, leaving behind a wreckage that would take a lifetime to clear. But in the middle of it all, an Apache warrior held a white woman. For the first time in the history of the territory, no one raised a gun to separate them. The smell of carbolic acid and copper blood was sharp enough to sting the eyes, but it could not mask the scent of death that had settled over the small dispensary room. Outside, the sun was setting in a blaze of indifferent glory, painting the dusty streets of Red Mesa in shades of violet and bruised orange. Inside, the world had narrowed down to the wooden table where Dr. Monroe lay, his breathing ragged and shallow. Claire Monroe stood over him, her hands covered in his blood. She had done everything he had taught her. She had clamped the artery. She had stitched the torn flesh where the bullet had entered his back. She had prayed to the Christian God and whispered the Apache chants for healing. But the bullet had done too much damage. "Claire," the doctor whispered. His voice was a dry rattle, like autumn leaves skittering on stone. "I am here, Father," Claire said, leaning close. She gripped his hand, her fingers slick with red. "Do not speak. Save your strength. There is nothing to save," he murmured, his eyes fluttering open. They were milky, unfocused, staring at the ceiling. He had stared at 1,000 times while thinking of his patients. "I saw him. Claire, I saw the soldier aim at the boy." "I know," Claire choked out, tears finally cutting hot tracks through the dust on her face. "You saved him. Father, the boy is alive." "Good," Dr. Monroe sighed. He squeezed her hand with surprising strength. "Listen to me. The world is going to get very loud now. They will try to tell you that what you did today was wrong. They will try to tell you that loyalty to the flag is more important than loyalty to the truth." He coughed, a wet, hacking sound that brought a fresh bubble of blood to his lips. Claire wiped it away with her sleeve. "Not everyone who wears a uniform is justice." "My daughter," he rasped. "You chose the right path. You stood in the gap." His breathing hitched. A long pause that made Claire's heart stop. Then he drew one last, shuddering breath. "Do not let them push you out," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "Do not retreat. Do not pull out. Even when they scream that you are wrong, you stand. You stand." The hand holding hers went limp. The chest ceased its rise and fall. Claire stood frozen for a long time. The silence in the room was absolute, broken only by the ticking of the clock on the wall and the distant, muffled shouting from the jailhouse down the street. She looked at her father's face, peaceful now in a way it had not been for years. He had spent his life trying to be neutral, trying to bridge the gap with bandages and silence. In the end, he had chosen a side, and it had cost him everything. "I will not," Claire whispered to the empty room. "I will not pull out." The arrival of Judge Percival Blackwood 3 days later brought a veneer of civilization back to Red Mesa. Though it was a thin and fragile coating, the judge was a man of the law, sent from the territorial capital of Tucson with a squad of federal marshals to restore order. He set up his court in the back room of the saloon, the only space large enough to hold the proceedings. The atmosphere in the town was poisonous. The battle in the square had left 5 soldiers dead, 3 townspeople wounded, and a divide so deep it felt like a canyon had opened up down the middle of Main Street. Half the town looked at Claire with reverence, seeing her as the woman who had stopped a massacre. The other half, the ones whose livelihoods depended on the railroad contracts or who had lost sons in the fighting, looked at her with cold, naked hatred. They called her the Apache witch when they thought she could not hear. The hearing was a tense affair. Colonel Briggs sat in the defendant's chair, his leg bandaged, his face a mask of sullen fury. Silas Hargrove sat beside him, immaculate in a fresh suit, looking less like a prisoner and more like an inconvenienced investor. Claire sat in the front row. She wore black, a stark contrast to the rough wood and tobacco-stained floor. Beside her sat Taza. It was unprecedented. An Apache warrior, armed with a knife though peace-bonded with leather thongs, sitting in a court of law. He did not slump. He did not look at the floor. He sat with the stillness of a hawk on a branch, watching the judge with unblinking dark eyes. "The evidence is substantial," Judge Blackwood said, adjusting his spectacles as he looked over the ledger and letters Claire had seized. "Bribery, conspiracy to incite violence, misuse of federal troops. It was necessary for the security of the territory," Briggs spat, slamming his hand on the table. "You cannot build a nation without cracking a few eggs. Judge, these savages stood in the way of progress, and you stood in the way of the law," Blackwood countered coldly. He turned to Silas. "And you, Mr. Hargrove, you funded this private war." "I merely protected my investors' interests," Silas said smoothly. "If Colonel Briggs interpreted my request for security as a license for slaughter, that is a regrettable military error. I am a businessman, not a general." Claire stood up. The movement drew every eye in the room. "You are a murderer," she said clearly. Her voice did not shake. "You hired the men who attacked me. You burned the Henderson Ranch. You killed my father as surely as if you pulled the trigger." "Objection." Silas's lawyer, a weaselly man who had arrived on the same stagecoach as the judge, jumped up. "This is hearsay and emotional hysteria." "Sit down, Miss Monroe," the judge ordered, though his tone was not unkind. "The court has the documents." The legal wrangling dragged on for hours. It became clear to Claire that while Briggs was finished his military career over, a prison cell awaiting him, Silas was slippery. He had money. He had connections in Washington. He was already weaving a web of plausible deniability that might just keep his neck out of a noose. That evening, the negotiations began. They were held in the church, a neutral ground sanctified by the blood that had almost been spilled on its steps. On one side of the long communion table sat Judge Blackwood and the acting commander of the military detachment. On the other side sat Taza, Mika, and 2 elders of the tribe. Claire stood at the head of the table. She was the bridge. Every word passed through her. The government proposes a reservation at San Carlos, the judge began. 70 miles south, arid, but secure. Claire translated. The elders' faces hardened like stone. We will not go to the prison land, Taza said in Apache. His voice was low, vibrating with the memory of his ancestors. We were born in the Owl Canyon. The bones of our fathers are in the cliffs. If you try to move us, we will fight until the last man falls. And this time, we will not stop at the canyon mouth. We will burn this town. Claire turned to the judge. He says that San Carlos is not an option. To move them is to declare war again. A war you cannot afford. The railroad must go through, the acting commander insisted. We cannot have hostiles flanking the supply line. We are not hostile unless you make us so, Taza replied through Claire. We offer a trade. We keep the upper canyon and the high plateau. We give you the lower pass for your iron road. We will not attack the trains. We will not attack the settlers. We will guard the pass against bandits who would prey on both of us. It was a generous offer. It was a strategic masterstroke. Taza was offering to become the guardians of the very thing that threatened them, in exchange for the right to exist. The negotiations went late into the night. Maps were drawn and redrawn. Voices were raised. But Claire held the line. She softened the insults, sharpened the logic, and kept the two sides from tearing each other apart. By midnight, a tentative agreement lay on the table. It was not perfect. The Apache lost the lower valley. The town lost its sense of absolute dominance. But the guns were silent. As the meeting broke up, Taza stopped beside Claire. He looked exhausted, the strain of navigating the white man's words etching deep lines around his mouth. You speak well, he said. For a moment, I thought you were a chief. I am just a translator, Claire said wearily. Like my mother. You are more, Taza said. He touched her arm briefly, a spark of heat that reminded her she was still alive. You are the shield bearer. The next morning, Deputy Lane found Claire in the dispensary. She was packing her father's personal effects into a wooden crate. Lane looked like a man who had aged 10 years in 3 days. He had shaved, and his uniform was clean, but his eyes were haunted. Claire, he said, twisting his hat in his hands. Deputy, she replied without looking up. I wanted to say I am sorry about your father. He was a good man. He was, Claire said. She placed a stethoscope into the box. He died saving a child you were keeping in a cage. Lane flinched. I was following orders. Claire, you know how Briggs was. If I had disobeyed, you would have been a man. Claire cut him off. Instead of a tool, Lane stepped forward. Please, do not be like this. It is over now. Briggs is gone. Silas is in custody. We can go back to how it was. He reached out, trying to take her hand. Marry me, Claire. I can protect you. The town, they are talking. They say you have gone native. They say you are unfit. If you marry me, I can stop the whispers. We can run this clinic together. You can be safe. Claire looked at him. She saw the desperation in his eyes. He offered safety. He offered respectability. He offered a life where she would never again have to smell gun smoke or hide in a cave. It was a tempting offer for a woman who had just lost her only family. But then she looked out the window. She saw the red cliffs of the canyon in the distance. She thought of the bone talisman in her pocket. She thought of Taza standing on the ridge, lowering his club because she asked him to. I cannot go back, Lane, she said softly. The woman you want to marry. She died in that stable the night I met Taza. You are making a mistake, Lane said, his voice rising with panic. You are throwing your life away for a savage who will never truly understand you. You belong here. With us. I do not know where I belong, Claire said. But I know I do not belong with a man who waits for permission to do what is right. She picked up the box. Goodbye, Lane. The internal struggle was not Claire's alone. In the temporary camp established on the high plateau, Taza faced his own tribunal. The firelight flickered on the faces of the warriors. Some looked at him with pride, others with suspicion. You sat at the table with the white men. a young warrior named Coco said, spitting into the fire. You signed a paper with the men who killed our healer. Who killed your father? I signed a paper that keeps our children from starving. Taza replied calmly. I signed a paper that keeps the soldiers from burning these tents tonight. It is a weakness, Coco challenged. We should have fought. We could have taken many of them with us. And then, Taza stood up. Then we are dead. And the memory of the Apache is dust in the wind. Is that what you want, glory for the dead, or a life for the living? He pointed toward the lights of Red Mesa in the distance. The world has changed. The Iron Horse is here. We cannot shoot it. We must learn to ride beside it without being crushed. That takes a different kind of courage. Mika stepped forward. Taza is right, she said. The white healer woman stood for us. She bled for us. If a white woman can fight for the Apache, can an Apache not fight for peace? The muttering died down. It was not a total victory. There were still dark looks, still hands gripping knife handles. But Taza had held the tribe together for one more night. 2 days before the judge was set to depart with the prisoners. Claire went to the sheriff's office to sign the final witness statements. The office was chaotic, filled with clerks and marshals. On a desk in the corner, a stack of confiscated papers from Silas Hargrove's hotel room was waiting to be catalogued. Claire saw a letter on top, half hidden by a ledger. The handwriting was bold and familiar. She glanced around. No one was watching. She lifted the ledger. It was a letter addressed to a board of directors in New York. It was dated the morning of the battle. The local opposition is temporary. Briggs is a blunt instrument, and if he fails, he is expendable. I have secured alternative funding. Even if the current treaty holds, the economic pressure will eventually force the savages out. We simply need to buy the land around the canyon, cut off their trade, and wait for a hard winter. I will return in the spring. This valley is too rich to leave to a dying race. Claire felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. Silas knew. He knew that a piece of paper meant nothing against the slow, grinding weight of money. He wasn't defeated. He was just regrouping. She folded the letter and slipped it into her pocket. The victory she had fought for, the victory her father had died for, was not a fortress. It was a sand castle, and the tide was still coming in. That night, she rode out to the edge of the town limits. Taza was waiting for her by a small fire he had built in the shelter of a rock overhang. It was the borderland, neither town nor canyon. He looked up as she approached. He saw the heaviness in her walk. You found something, he said. It was not a question. Claire sat beside him. She did not show him the letter. She did not need to. Silas will be back, she said. Or another man like him, the paper we signed. It is just a pause. Taza poked the fire with a stick. Sparks swirled up into the black sky. I know. The wolf does not stop hunting just because he is full tonight. Lane asked me to marry him, Claire said abruptly. Taza went still. He did not look at her. And he offered me a house, a practice, safety. It's a good offer, Taza said, his voice flat. He can give you things I cannot, a roof that does not leak, a life where you are not hunted. Is that what you think I want? Claire asked. She turned to him, anger flashing in her eyes. After everything, I think you are a white woman, Taza said, looking at her finally. And I am an Apache. The bridge we built, it is made of smoke. Claire, one strong wind, and it is gone. Then we build it out of stone, she snapped. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the bone talisman he had given her. She held it up. My father told me not to pull out. He told me to stand. If I go back to Lane, I will pull out. I am retreating. She took a breath, the cool night air filling her lungs. I am not going back to the dispensary. I am going to petition the judge tomorrow. I want the deed to the old trading post at the mouth of the canyon, the one that burned down 10 years ago. Taza frowned. Why? I'm going to build a clinic there, Claire said. And a school. Not in the town, not in the canyon. On the line. I will teach the children white and Apache. I will heal whoever walks through the door. She looked at him, her heart in her eyes. But I cannot do it alone. It will be dangerous. The town will hate it. Some of your people will hate it. I need a guardian." Taza looked at her. He looked at the fire in her eyes, a fire that matched his own. He realized that she was not asking for permission. She was offering an alliance, a partnership, a school, he mused, where a white child learned to speak Apache, and where an Apache child learns to read the contracts so they cannot be cheated, Claire added. A slow smile spread across Taza's face. It changed him, softening the warrior's mask into something younger, something hopeful. "It is a dangerous path," he said. "This is where we belong," Claire whispered, echoing the words he had said to her in the cave. "We stay," Taza said. He reached out and covered her hand with his. "We do not run. We stay." The next morning, the sun rose over a changed world. Colonel Briggs and Silas Hargrove were loaded onto a wagon, shackled in irons, to be taken to Tucson. The townspeople watched in silence. There were no cheers, but there was a sense of a heavy weight lifting. Judge Blackwood signed the temporary treaty. He also signed a land grant for the ruined trading post to Miss Claire Monroe. As the dust from the judge's carriage settled, Claire stood at the edge of the town. She had a hammer in her hand and a bag of nails at her feet. She was looking toward the west, toward the spot where the new building would rise. Taza rode up on his paint horse. He did not dismount. He simply nodded to her, a gesture of respect and promise. He turned his horse and rode up the ridge, taking his post as the watcher. The town was still divided. The hate was still there, simmering under the surface. The railroad was still coming, but out there, on the edge of the wild, a stake had been driven into the ground. Claire Monroe picked up a board and began to nail it to the frame of the old post. The sound of the hammer striking iron rang out across the valley, a sharp, clear note of defiance and construction. It was not a happy ending. It was the beginning. And for now, that was enough. The steam whistle of the locomotive echoed off the Red Canyon walls, a long, mournful sound that had become as regular as the rising sun. It was the year 1879. 4 years had passed since the blood had dried in the town square of Red Mesa, and the world had moved on, carried forward on iron rails and wooden ties. The train did not cut through the heart of Owl Canyon. It curved in a wide, respectful arc to the south, following the survey line that had been drawn on a map by a trembling hand in a church vestry. The Silver Star Rail Company had gotten their route, but they had paid for it with a compromise. Red Mesa itself had swollen in size. The tents had been replaced by clapboard houses, and the main street now boasted a brick bank and a hotel with glass windows imported all the way from St. Louis. It was a bustling, noisy, dirty hub of commerce. But the heart of the story was no longer in the town square. It had moved 3 miles west, to the borderland where the sagebrush met the red rock. There, standing defiant against the vastness of the desert, was a long, low building made of timber and adobe. It was not just a house. It was a fortress of a different kind. Claire Monroe stood on the porch, wiping her hands on her apron. She looked different than the terrified young woman who had once hidden a wounded warrior in a stable. The sun had etched fine lines around her eyes, and her skin was browned by the wind. She wore a simple dress of blue calico, practical and sturdy, but around her neck hung a string of turquoise and white shell beads, a gift from the tribe, worn openly, a declaration of allegiance that no longer needed to be whispered. Her hands were stained with black ink and red clay, ink from the lessons she had taught that morning, and clay from the poultice she had mixed for a railway worker's crushed foot. A is for apple. A chorus of voices chanted from inside the open door. A is for manzanita. Claire smiled. Inside the single large room, 20 children sat on rough-hewn benches. Half of them were white, the children of miners and homesteaders who could not afford the private tutor in town. The other half were Apache, their dark hair braided, their eyes bright with curiosity. They sat side by side. It was not a perfect harmony. There were still squabbles, still moments of suspicion learned from their parents. But here, in this room, they shared the same slate boards and drank from the same water bucket. Mika, now a young woman of 20, moved among them. She was teaching the older girls how to identify the mallow plant for soothing coughs. In the corner, old Reverend Thomas sat in a rocking chair. He was too frail to preach much anymore, but he had found a new congregation. He watched the children with a bemused expression. Having finally accepted that God might speak in languages other than the King James English, Claire walked down the steps to the yard. A man was working by the corral, hammering a loose rail back into place. Taza had cut his hair shorter, though he still refused to wear the stiff woolen trousers of the white men, preferring his buckskins. He looked up as she approached. The years had been hard on him, too. There was a new scar on his forearm from a skirmish with bandits the previous winter, and the responsibility of leadership weighed heavy on his shoulders. He was no longer just a warrior. He was a bridge builder, a diplomat, and a husband. He still carried the Colt revolver at his hip, and the knife was never far from his hand. Peace was a fragile thing, and Taza was its armed guard. "The roof holds," Taza said, nodding toward the schoolhouse. "I reinforced the beams against the wind." "You are a good builder." "Taza," Claire said, handing him a ladle of water from the bucket she carried. He drank deeply, the water running down his chin. He wiped it away and looked at her. The intensity that had first drawn them together in the dark of the stable had not faded. It had merely settled, becoming as solid and enduring as the bedrock beneath their feet. "The horse of the new settler needs shoeing," Taza observed, looking toward a wagon parked near the creek. "And the survey map for the northern trail needs to be finished. If we do not mark the boundaries clearly, the cattlemen will drift onto the tribal grazing land again." "Always work," Claire sighed, though there was contentment in her voice. "Work is better than war," Taza replied. He reached out and brushed a smudge of ink from her cheek. His touch was calloused and rough, but gentle. "You look tired, teacher." "It is very tiring," Claire said. She looked back at the schoolhouse. Above the door hung a sign that Taza had carved himself. It read, "Owl Canyon School Clinic" in bold English letters, and below it, burned into the wood, were the Apache symbols for House of Healing and Learning. It was a small thing, that sign, but in a territory defined by fences and no trespassing warnings, it was a revolution. The peace of the afternoon was broken by the arrival of a rider from town. It was a young boy, the son of the station master, bringing the weekly mail. He handed a bundle of letters to Claire and rode off quickly, still uneasy about being so close to the Indian camp, as the townspeople called it. Claire sat on the bench outside the clinic to sort through the post. There was a catalog for medical supplies from Boston, a letter from a cousin she barely remembered, and a folded newspaper from Tucson. She opened the paper. The headline screamed out at her in bold black type, "Hargrove acquitted. Rail tycoon vows to expand Western holdings." The air in Claire's lungs seemed to turn to ice. The sounds of the children playing, the rhythmic hammering of Taza at the corral, the whistle of the distant train. It all faded into a buzzing silence. Silas Hargrove was free. The letters she had found, the testimony, the bribery charges his lawyers had maneuvered through it all. He was coming back, not with an army this time, but with something more insidious: money, lawyers, and political pressure. Claire felt a hand on her shoulder. She jumped. Taza was standing behind her. He did not need to read the headline to know what it said. He saw the fear in her posture. "He is coming back," Claire whispered, the paper crinkling in her grip. "Silas, he beat the charges." Taza took the paper from her hand. He looked at the grainy illustration of the smiling man in the silk suit. "The snake sheds its skin," Taza said quietly. "But it is still a snake." "We cannot fight him again." "Taza," Claire said, standing up and pacing the small porch. Her hands were shaking. "Not like last time. He will be careful now. He will use the law. He will squeeze us out inch by inch. He will raise the taxes on the land grant. He will cut off the water rights." She looked at the western horizon, where the sun was beginning to dip into a haze of dust. A sandstorm was brewing, turning the sky a bruised purple. "We could leave," she said suddenly. The words tumbled out of her mouth. We could sell the grant. With the money, we could move west, California, or north to Oregon. Somewhere he isn't, somewhere we can just be. It was the fear of speaking, the old primal fear that had lived in her gut for 4 years, whispering that this life she had built was made of glass. Taza watched her. He saw the panic rising in her, the instinct to flee before the storm hit. He stepped forward and wrapped his arms around her from behind. He pulled her back against his chest, his chin resting on the top of her head. He was solid, warm, and immovable. "Look," he whispered, pointing toward the canyon. The last light of the day was hitting the red walls, making them glow as if they were burning from within. The smoke from the Apache campfires rose in thin, straight columns, joining the smoke from the schoolhouse chimney. "This is the land of my fathers," Taza said. "And now, it is the land of your children." Claire trembled in his arms. "I am afraid. Taza, I'm afraid that I cannot stop him this time." Taza turned her around so she had to look at him. His eyes were dark and fierce, filled with the same resolve that had held the line on the high plateau. "Don't you dare pull out," he ordered. The words hung in the air, an echo of the command she'd given him in the cave years ago. Then, it had been a plea for him to stay alive. Now, it was a vow. "We do not run," Taza said, his voice rough with emotion. "We do not let him define where we stand. If he comes with lawyers, we will learn the law better. If he comes with money, we will build things money cannot buy. But we will not leave." He took her face in his hands, his thumbs tracing the line of her jaw. His hands were shaking slightly, not from fear, but from the intensity of his love for her and for this fragile, beautiful life they had carved out of the rock. "This is where we belong," he whispered. Claire looked at him. She saw the warrior who had laid down his club. She saw the man who had planted the cottonwood trees along the creek. She saw the partner who had stood by her when the whole world called her a traitor. The panic in her chest began to recede, replaced by a steel spine of determination. She took a deep breath, smelling the sage and the coming rain. "You are right," she said, covering his hands with hers. "We stay. We stay," Taza affirmed. He kissed her then, not with the desperate hunger of their first kiss in the cave, but with the deep, slow familiarity of a husband. It was a kiss that tasted of dust and promise. Night fell over the borderlands. The sandstorm passed to the north, leaving the air clear and cold. Inside the schoolhouse, the lamps were lit. Claire was grading papers, correcting the spelling of liberty and river. Taza sat by the potbelly stove, cleaning his rifle. It was a domestic scene, quiet and ordinary. Yet it was the most extraordinary victory imaginable. Outside, the world was still dangerous. There were still men like Silas Hargrove who viewed the land as a ledger to be balanced. There were still people in town who crossed the street when Claire walked by. There was still hunger and drought and the hard, grinding work of survival. But as the camera of history pulls back, away from the window, rising into the cool night air, the picture becomes clear. To the east, the twin rails of the Silver Star Line glint under the moonlight, cold and indifferent, rushing toward the Pacific. To the west, the dark shapes of the Apache horses graze on the hillside, their silhouettes moving like ghosts against the silver grass. And in the middle, in the small adobe house between the canyon and the town, a light burns. The sound of a coyote howling is answered by the laughter of a child waking from a dream. The drums of war are silent, replaced by the scratching of a pen on paper and the steady heartbeat of a community that refused to be torn apart. This was not a fairy tale. There was no magic that erased the scars or brought back the dead. It was simply a corner of the violent, beautiful frontier where two people had drawn a line in the red dirt and said, "Enough. We build here." And in the silence of the desert, the wind remembered their promise. Thank you for listening to this story on Wild West Tales. If this story of Claire and Taza touched your heart, or if you enjoyed this journey through the dust and danger of the American frontier, please let me know in the comments below. Where are you listening from? I would love to hear your thoughts on their choice to stay and fight for their home. Please consider subscribing to the channel, hitting that like button, and smashing the hype button to help this story reach more listeners. Your support helps keep the spirit of the Wild West alive. Until next time, keep your powder dry and your eyes on the horizon.